a WikiVidi documentaries production. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Enjoy. Mikoyan-Gurevich MiG-21. The Mikoyan-Gurevich MiG-21 is a supersonic jet fighter and interceptor aircraft, designed by the Mikoyan-Gurevich Design Bureau in the Soviet Union. It was popularly nicknamed balalaika, from the aircraft's planform-view resemblance to the Russian stringed musical instrument or ołówek by Polish pilots due to the shape of its fuselage. It was also nicknamed N-back by North Vietnamese. Now Vietnam People's Air Force, pilots and the Vietnamese people. Approximately 60 countries over 4 continents have flown the MiG-21, and it still serves many nations 6 decades after its maiden flight. It made aviation records, became the most produced supersonic jet aircraft in aviation history, the most produced combat aircraft since the Korean War, and previously the longest production run of a combat aircraft. Origins. The MiG-21 jet fighter was a continuation of Soviet jet fighters, starting with the subsonic MiG-15 and MiG-17, and the supersonic MiG-19. A number of experimental Mach 2 Soviet designs were based on nose intakes with either swept-back wings, such as the Sukhoi Su-7, or tailed deltas, of which the MiG-21 would be the most successful. Development of what would become the MiG-21 began in the early 1950s, when Mikoyan-Gurevich finished a preliminary design study for a prototype designated E-1 in 1954. This project was very quickly reworked when it was determined that the planned engine was underpowered. The redesign led to the second prototype, the E-2. Both these and other early prototypes featured swept wings. The first prototype with delta wings as found on production variants was the E-4. It made its maiden flight on the 16th of June 1955. And its first public appearance during the Soviet Aviation Day display at Moscow's Tushino airfield in July 1956. In the West, due to the lack of available information, early details of the MiG-21 often were confused with those of similar Soviet fighters of the era. In one instance, Jane's All the World's Aircraft 1960-1961 listed the fishbed as a Sukhoi design, and used an illustration of the Su-9 fishpot design. The MiG-21 was the first successful Soviet aircraft combining fighter and interceptor characteristics in a single aircraft. It was a lightweight fighter, achieving Mach 2 with a relatively low-powered afterburning turbojet, and is thus comparable to the American Lockheed F-104 Starfighter and Northrop F-5 Freedom Fighter and the French Dassault Mirage 3. Its basic layout was used for numerous other Soviet designs. Delta-winged aircraft included Su-9 Interceptor and the fast T-150 prototype from MiG Bureau, while the mass-produced successful front fighter Su-7 and Mikoyan's I-75 experimental interceptor combined a similar fuselage shape with swept-back wings. However, the characteristic layout with the shock cone and front air intake did not see widespread use outside the USSR, and finally proved to have limited development potential, mainly because of the very small space available for the radar. Like many aircraft designed as interceptors, the MiG-21 had a short range. This was exacerbated by the poor placement of the internal fuel tanks ahead of the center of gravity. As the internal fuel was consumed, the center of gravity would shift rearward beyond acceptable parameters. This had the effect of making the plane statically unstable to the point of being difficult to control, resulting in an endurance of only 45 minutes in clean condition. This can be somewhat countered by carrying fuel in external tanks closer to the center of gravity. The Chinese variants somewhat improved the internal fuel tank layout, and also carry significantly larger external fuel tanks to counter this issue. Additionally, when more than half the fuel was used up, violent maneuvers prevented fuel from flowing into the engine, thereby causing it to shut down in flight. This increased the risk of tank implosions, a problem inherited from the MiG-15, MiG-17 and MiG-19. The short endurance and low fuel capacity of the MiG-21F, PF, FEM, S/SM, and M/MF variants, though each had a somewhat greater fuel capacity than its predecessor, led to the development of the Mount and SMT variants. These had an increased range of 250 kilometers compared to the MiG-21 SM, but at the cost of worsening all other performance figures, such as a lower service ceiling and slower time to altitude. The delta wing, while excellent for a fast-climbing interceptor, meant any form of turning combat led to a rapid loss of speed. However, the light loading of the aircraft could mean that a climb rate of 235 meters per second was possible with a combat-loaded MiG-21 bis, not far short of the performance of the later F-16A. Given a skilled pilot and capable missiles, it could give a good account of itself against contemporary fighters. Its G limits were increased from 7 Gs in initial variants to 8.5 Gs in the latest variants. It was replaced by the newer variable geometry MiG-23 and MiG-27 for ground support duties. However, not until the MiG-29 would the Soviet Union ultimately replace the MiG-21 as a maneuvering dogfighter to counter new American air superiority types. The MiG-21 was exported widely and remains in use. The aircraft's simple controls, engine, weapons, and avionics were typical of Soviet-era military designs. The use of a tail with the delta wing aids stability and control at the extremes of the flight envelope, enhancing safety for lower-skilled pilots. This in turn enhanced its marketability and exports to developing countries with limited training programs and restricted pilot pools. While technologically inferior to the more advanced fighters it often faced, low production and maintenance costs made it a favorite of nations buying Eastern Bloc military hardware. Several Russian, Israeli, and Romanian firms have begun to offer upgrade packages to MiG-21 operators, designed to bring the aircraft up to a modern standard, with greatly upgraded avionics and armaments. Production. A total of 10,645 aircraft were built in the USSR. They were produced in 3 factories, AZ-30 in Moscow, GAZ-21 in Gorky and TAZ-31 in Tbilisi. Generally, Gorky built single-seaters for the Soviet forces, Moscow constructed single-seaters for export, and Tbilisi manufactured the twin-seaters both for export and the USSR, though there were exceptions. The MiG-21R and MiG-21 bis for export and for the USSR were built in Gorky. 17 single-seaters were homed in Tbilisi. The MiG-21MF was first constructed in Moscow and then Gorky, and the MiG-21U was built in Moscow as well as in Tbilisi. A total of 194 MiG-21 F-13s were built under license in Czechoslovakia, and Hindustan Aeronautics Limited of India built 657 MiG-21 FL, MiG-21M and MiG-21 bis. Design. The MiG-21 has a delta wing. The sweep angle on the leading edge is 57 degrees with a Tees-Agi S12 airfoil. The angle of incidence is 0 degrees while the dihedral angle is -2 degrees. On the trailing edge there are ailerons with an area of 1.18 square meters, and flaps with an area of 1.87 square meters. In front of the ailerons there are small wing fences. The fuselage is semi-monocoque with an elliptical profile, and a maximum width of 1.24 meters. The airflow to the engine is regulated by an inlet cone in the air intake. On early model MiG-21s, the cone has 3 positions. For speeds up to Mach 1.5 the cone is fully retracted to the maximum aft position. For speeds between Mach 1.5 and Mach 1.9 the cone moves to the middle position. For speeds higher than Mach 1.9 the cone moves to the maximum forward position. On the later model MiG-21 PF, the intake cone moves to a position based on the actual speed. The cone position for a given speed is calculated by the UVD2M system using air pressures from in front and behind the compressor of the engine. On both sides of the nose there are gills to supply the engine with more air while on the ground and during takeoff. In the first variant of the MiG-21, the pitot tube is attached to the bottom of the nose. After the MiG-21P variant, this tube is attached to the top of the air intake. Later versions shifted the pitot tube attachment point 15 degrees to the right, as seen from the cockpit, and had an emergency pitot head on the right side, just ahead of the canopy and below the pilot's eye line. The cabin is pressurized and air-conditioned. On variants prior to the MiG-21 FEM, the cabin canopy is hinged at the front. When ejecting, the SK-1 ejection seat connects with the canopy to make a capsule that encloses the pilot. The capsule protects the pilot from the high-speed airflow encountered during high-speed ejections. After ejection, the capsule opens to allow the pilot to parachute to the ground. However, ejecting at low altitudes can cause the canopy to take too long to separate, sometimes resulting in pilot death. The minimum height for ejection in level flight was 110 meters, starting from the MiG-21 PFM. The canopy is hinged on the right side of the cockpit. On the underside of the aircraft there are 3 air brakes, 2 at the front and 1 at the rear. The front air brakes have an area of 0.76 square meters and a deflection angle of 35 degrees. The rear air brake has an area of 0.46 square meters and a deflection angle of 40 degrees. The rear air brake is blocked if the airplane carries an external fuel tank. Behind the air brakes are the bays for the main landing gear. On the underside of the airplane, just behind the trailing edge of the wing, are attachment points for 2 JATO rockets. The front section of the fuselage ends at Former 8. The rear section of the fuselage starts at Former 8A and is removable for engine maintenance. The empennage of the MiG-21 consists of a vertical stabilizer, a stabilator, and a small fin on the bottom of the tail to improve your control. The vertical stabilizer has a sweep angle of 60 degrees and an area of 5.32 square meters and a rudder. The stabilator has a sweep angle of 57 degrees, an area of 3.94 square meters, and a span of 2.6 meters. The MiG-21 uses a tricycle-type undercarriage. On most variants the main landing gear uses tires that are 800 mm in diameter and 200 mm in width. Only the MiG-21F variants use tires with the size 660 by 200. The wheels of the main landing gear retract into the fuselage after rotating 87 degrees and the shock absorbers retract into the wing. The nose gear retracts forward into the fuselage under the radar. The nose wheel can be lowered manually by simply unlocking its hatch from inside the cockpit. Thus, landing with undercarriage locked in the up position due to an internal failure was not a major issue, with a number of such successful landings on the nose wheel, ventral fuel tank or the air brake. Overview. India is the largest operator of MiG-21s. In 1961, the Indian Air Force opted to purchase the MiG-21 over several other Western competitors. As part of the deal, the Soviet Union offered India full transfer of technology and rights for local assembly. In 1964, the MiG-21 became the first supersonic fighter jet to enter service with the IAF. Due to limited induction numbers and lack of pilot training, the IAF MiG-21 played a limited role in the Indo-Pakistani War of 1965. However, the IAF gained valuable experience while operating the MiG-21 for defensive sorties during the war. The positive feedback from IAF pilots during the 1965 war prompted India to place more orders for the fighter jet and also invest heavily in building the MiG-21's maintenance infrastructure and pilot training programs. Since 1963, India has introduced more than 1,200 MiG fighters into its air force. As of 2019, 113 MiG-21s are known to be in operation in the IAF. However, the plane has been plagued by safety problems. Since 1970, more than 170 Indian pilots and 40 civilians have been killed in MiG-21 accidents. At least 14 MiG-21s have crashed between 2010 and 2013. Over half of the 840 aircraft built between 1966 and 1984 were lost to crashes. When in afterburner, the engine operates very close to its surge line and the ingestion of even a small bird can lead to an engine surge/seizure and flameout. On the 11th of December 2013, India's second-generation supersonic jet fighter, MiG-21FL, was decommissioned after being in service for 50 years. In view of the several incidents that have occurred after the 1999 Kargil War, the modernized MiG-21 Bison seems to have it present the role of an interceptor and possibly a limited role of a fighter aircraft. On 8 March 2019, an Indian MiG-21 crashed in Rajasthan due to bird hit. The pilot safely ejected. 1971 India-Pakistan War. The expansion of IAF MiG-21 fleet marked a developing India-Soviet Union military partnership, which enabled India to field a formidable air force to counter Chinese and Pakistani threats. The capabilities of the MiG-21 were put to the test during the Bangladesh Liberation War. During the war, the MiG-21s played a crucial role in giving the IAF air superiority over vital points and areas in the Western theater of the conflict. The 1971 war witnessed the first supersonic air combat in the subcontinent when an Indian MiG-21 FLS claimed a PAF F-104 starfighter with its GSH-23 twin-barreled 23mm cannon. By the time the hostilities came to an end, the IAF MiG-21s had claimed 4 PAF F-104s, 2 PAF Shenyang F-6, 1 PAF North American F-86 Sabre and 1 PAF Lockheed C-130 Hercules. According to one Western military analyst, the MiG-21s had clearly won the much-anticipated air combat between the MiG-21 and the F-104 starfighter. Because of the performance of India's MiG-21s, several nations, including Iraq, approached India for MiG-21 pilot training. By the early 1970s, more than 120 Iraqi pilots were being trained by the Indian Air Force. Indonesia. The Indonesian Air Force purchased 22 MiG-21s. In 1962, 20 MiG-21 F-13s and MiG-21Us were received during Operation Trikora in the Western New Guinea conflict. Indonesian MiG-21s never fought in any dogfights. Right after the US-backed anti-communist forces took over the government, 13 Indonesian MiG-21s were delivered to the US in exchange for T-33, A-34D, and later, F-5 and F-10 aircraft. All remaining MiG-21s were grounded and retired due to lack of spare parts and the withdrawal of Soviet maintenance support. The MiGs were added to the 4,477th Test and Evaluation Squadron, a USAF aggressor squadron at Tonopah Test Range. Vietnam. As may be seen from its range figures, the MiG-21 was designed for very short ground-controlled interception missions. It became renowned for this type of mission in the skies over North Vietnam. The first MiG-21s arrived directly from the Soviet Union by ship in April 1966. After being unloaded and assembled, they were given to North Vietnam's oldest fighter unit, the 921st Fighter Regiment, which had been created on 3 February 1964 as a MiG-17 unit. Because the Vietnam People's Air Force's 923rd FR was newer and less experienced, they would continue to operate MiG-17s. While the arrival of the MiG-19s from China in 1969 would create North Vietnam's only MiG-19 unit, the 925th father on 3 February 1972, North Vietnam commissioned their 4th and last fighter regiment created during the war with South Vietnam, the MiG-21 PFM-equipped 927th Fighter Regiment. Although 13 of North Vietnam's flying aces attained their status while flying the MiG-21, many VPAF pilots preferred the MiG-17, because the high wing loading of the MiG-21 made it relatively less maneuverable, and the lighter framed canopy of the MiG-17 gave better visibility. However, this is not the impression perceived by British author Roger Boniface when he interviewed Pham Ngoc Lan and Ace Win Nyut Chua. Pham Ngoc Lan told Boniface that the MiG-21 was much faster, and it had 2 atoll missiles which were very accurate and reliable when fired between 1,000 and 1,200 yards. And Chua asserted that, "For me personally, I preferred the MiG-21, because it was superior in all specifications in climb, speed and armament. The atoll missile was very accurate and I scored 4 kills with the atoll. In general combat conditions I was always confident of a kill over AF-4 Phantom when flying a MiG-21. Although the MiG-21 lacked the long-range radar, missiles, and heavy bomb load of its contemporary multi-mission U.S. fighters, with its RP-21 Sapphire radar it proved a challenging adversary in the hands of experienced pilots, especially when used in high-speed hit-and-run attacks under GCI control. MiG-21 intercepts of Republic F-105 Thunder Chief strike groups were effective in downing U.S. aircraft or forcing them to jettison their bomb loads. Aerial combat victories 1966, 1972, Sources: Hobson, Topex. The North Vietnamese flew their interceptors with guidance from ground controllers, who positioned the MiGs in ambush battle stations to make their one-pass, then haul-ass attacks. The MiGs made fast and often accurate attacks against U.S. formations from several directions. After shooting down a few American planes and forcing some of the F-105s to drop their bombs prematurely, the MiGs did not wait for retaliation, but disengaged rapidly. These guerrilla warfare in the air tactics generally proved successful during the course of the war. In December 1966, the MiG-21 pilots of the 921st FR downed 14 F-105 Thunder Chiefs without any losses. The USAF and the U.S. Navy had high expectations of the F-4 Phantom, assuming that the massive firepower, the best available on-board radar, the highest speed and acceleration properties, coupled with new tactics, would provide Phantoms with an advantage over the MiGs. But in confrontations with the lighter MiG-21, F-4s began to suffer losses. From May to December 1966, the USAF lost 47 aircraft, destroying only 12 PAF fighters in return. From April 1965 to November 1968, over 268 air battles occurred over the skies of North Vietnam. North Vietnam claimed 244 downed U.S. aircraft, while admitting to the loss of 85 MiGs. Of these, 46 air battles conducted between F-4s and MiG-21s. The losses were 27 F-4 Phantoms and 20 MiG-21s. After a million sorties and nearly 1,000 U.S. aircraft losses, Operation Rolling Thunder came to an end on 1 November 1968. A poor air-to-air combat loss exchange ratios against the smaller, more agile enemy MiGs during the early part of the Vietnam War eventually led the U.S. Navy to create their Navy Fighter Weapons School, also known as Top Gun, at Naval Air Station Miramar, California on 3 March 1969. The USAF quickly followed with their own version, titled the Dissimilar Air Combat Training Program at Nellis Air Force Base, Nevada. These two programs employed the subsonic Douglas A-4 Skyhawk and the supersonic F-5 Tiger II, as well as the Mach 2.4 capable USAF Convair F-106 Delta Dart, which mimicked the MiG-21. The culmination of the struggle in the air in early 1972 was the 10th of May, when PAF aircraft completed 64 sorties, resulting in 15 air battles. The PAF claimed 7 F-4s were shot down. Those, in turn, managed to destroy 2 MiG-21s, 3 MiG-17s and 1 MiG-19. On the 11th of May, 2 MiG-21s, who played the role of bait, brought 4 F-4s to 2 MiG-21s circling at low altitude. The MiGs quickly stormed the Phantoms and 3 missiles shot down 2 F-4s. On the 13th of May, a MiG-21 unit intercepted a group of F-4s. The second pair of MiGs made a missile attack and were hit by 2 F-4s. The 18th of May, Vietnamese aircraft made 26 sorties, 8 of which resulted in combat, costing 4 F-4s, while the PAF did not suffer any losses. Over the course of the air war, between the 3rd of April 1965 and the 8th of January 1973, each side would ultimately claim favorable kill ratios. In 1972, the tally between American and Vietnamese planes stood at 201 air battles. The PAF lost 54 MiGs and they claimed 90 U.S. aircraft were shot down, including 74 F-4 fighters and 2 RF-4C reconnaissance jets. 1 MiG-21 was shot down on the 21st of February 1972 by a U.S. Air Force F-4 Phantom piloted by Major Lodge, with First Lieutenant Roger Locker as his WSO based at Udon, Thailand. This was claimed to be the first ever U.S. Air Force MiG kill at night, and the first in 4 years at that time. 2 MiG-21s were claimed shot down by USAF Boeing B-52 Stratofortress tail gunners, the only confirmed air-to-air kills made by the B-52. The first aerial victory occurred on the 18th of December 1972. Kill awarded to tail gunner Staff Sergeant Samuel Turner, who was awarded the Silver Star. The second air-to-air kill took place on the 24th of December 1972. Kill awarded to A1C Albert E. Moore for downing a MiG-21 over the Tai Win Railroad yards. Both actions occurred during Operation Linebacker 2. These air-to-air kills were not confirmed by VPAF. The biggest threat to North Vietnam during the war had always been the Strategic Air Command's B-52 Stratofortress. Hanoi MiG-17 and MiG-19 interceptors could not deal with those bombers at their flying altitude. In the summer of 1972, the VPAF was directed to train 12 MiG-21 pilots for the specific mission of attacking and shooting down B-52 bombers, with two-thirds of those pilots specifically trained in the night attack. On the 26th of December 1972, just 2 days after tail gunner Albert Moore downed his MiG-21, a VPAF MiG-21MF from the 921st Fighter Regiment, flown by Major Pham Ton over Hanoi, claimed the first aerial combat kill of a B-52 Stratofortress. The B-52 had been above Hanoi at over 30,000 feet when Major Cone launched 2 atoll missiles from 2 kilometers, claiming to have destroyed one of the bombers flying in the 3-plane formation. Other sources argue that his missiles failed to hit their mark, but as he was disengaging, a B-52 from a 3-bomber cell in front of his target took a hit from a SAM, exploding in mid-air. This may have caused Tone to think his missiles destroyed the target he had been aiming for. The Vietnamese claim another kill to have taken place on the 28th of December 1972 by a MiG-21 from the 921st FR, this time flown by Vu Sun Tu. Teo is said to have perished in the explosion of a B-52 hit by his own missiles, having approached the target too closely. In this case, the Vietnamese version appears to be erroneous. While one MiG-21 kill was claimed by Phantoms that night, no B-52s were lost to any cause on the date of the claimed kill. On the 3rd of January 1968, a MiG-21 pilot, Ha Van Chuk, alone entered into battle with 36 American planes and claimed shot down one F-105 Thunder Chief during the Vietnam War. The VPAF claimed 103 F-4 Phantoms were shot down by MiG-21s, and they lost 60 MiG-21s in air combat. According to Russian data, in air battles the North Vietnamese, MiG-21s credited 165 air victories, with the loss of 65 aircraft and 16 pilots. The losses of the MiG-21 pilots were the smallest in comparison with all other airplanes. Brought to you by WikiVidi Documentaries. Would you like to know more?